men, Archelaus and Antipas, were both full brothers from Herod and a Samaritan woman named Malthrace, Malthrace. Now that'll be a little unique in that these two brothers are full brothers, because so many of these brothers that we're going to mention, many of them, we'll be mentioning before we're through with this evening's teaching, are only half brothers, or not full brothers. So remember that Archelaus and Antipas are full brothers of Herod and a Samaritan woman named Malthrace. Now Herod, you will remember, Herod the Great, you will remember, descended from Antipater, who was an Idumean. And now he comes through Herod's wife, Malthrace, who was a Samaritan. That makes him half Edomite and half Samaritan. So that makes Antipas as well as Archelaus, that puts them in a category that's totally outside of Israel. That would give them political, particularly religious problems in Israel, being half Idumean and half Samaritan. In other words, not Jewish at all. Both of them, both Archelaus and Antipas, were raised and educated in Rome, spent the majority of their early existence in Rome, became accustomed to the extravagances, to the luxury, to the palatial buildings of the city, capital city of Rome. Where was Archelaus an ethnarch? What territory did he govern? Just think of south. South as opposed to Antipas, who is north. Archelaus controlled Idumea, Judea, Samaria. Herod Antipas, not an ethnarch, but a tetrarch. Just north, we primarily think of, and east, but primarily north of his brother Archelaus. He controls Galilee, and across the Jordan River from Jordan, he controls Perea. P-E-R-A-E-A, Perea. Galilee and Perea. Herod Antipas, which will be our topic this evening, was the most famous of Herod the Great's sons. We'll probably end up spending a little more time on him than with Archelaus. Well, definitely so, because it'll take all of this evening, and we probably won't get through. And Archelaus, although we dealt a lot with him, we dealt a lot, first of all, in the message prior to this with these various distinctions, titles, kings, ethnarch, legate, procurator, prefect, tetrarch, and so forth. So we're to our tetrarchy category, because this is what Herod Antipas was. Now, Archelaus, we said, was alive and ruling in Judea from 4 B.C. to A.D. 6, which gives him a rather short reign of only 10 years. Probably that puts him already banished in Gaul by the time Jesus makes his first recorded in Luke's Gospel visit to Jerusalem and to the temple, the age of 12, which was perhaps around A.D. 7, which would have been 1 year past the time of Archelaus. I think we had said that beginning in A.D. 6, after Archelaus is banished, then the southern territory there, primarily Judea, but thinking of Judea and Samaria, were turned over to Roman government in its immediate sense and was governed by prefects or procurators after that time. We'll discuss that whenever we come to the time of Pontius Pilate. So he has a relatively short reign of only a decade. However, on the other side of the coin, Herod Antipas is quite different. He rules for around 45 years, from 4 B.C. to around A.D. 39. 4.5 decades, 2 1/4 score years, 45 years, which means he was there at the beginning, throughout, and beyond the life of Christ. Jesus, remember, was brought up in Nazareth. We'll show you where some of these places are here in a moment. He was brought up in Nazareth. Herod Antipas had his capital not far from there, just a few miles to the east. Jesus would have been quite familiar with the man, and we find from the gospel accounts the man, Herod Antipas, becomes quite familiar with Jesus by the end of his ministry. This is the Herod I guess you should pay particular attention to, because he's the one who most figures in the gospel narratives. Archelaus, remember, really only appears over there in Matthew chapter 2. It's really the only place that he's appearing. Herod Antipas, however, is going to appear many, many times. Now, an initial warning here, he's not referred to as Herod Antipas. How is he referred to in the Gospels? Herod, just as Herod. He's the Herod that generally is appearing. If it's Herod the Great, generally it's distinguished by him being called Herod, king of Judea, or king of the Jews. If it's just Herod by itself, then we're probably talking about Herod Antipas. If it's Herod Philip, or if it's just Philip, we're talking about one or two other brothers, or really I should say half-brothers, that are related through Herod, but through another mother to both Herod Antipas and to Archelaus. So this is what makes Herod Antipas significant as far as we are concerned. By the way, just kind of getting a little ahead of myself, we're going to be looking at three particular episodes or events that are found in the Gospels where Herod Antipas so directly figures into the narrative. We'll get through one or through hopefully two of those this evening, maybe part of the way into the third one, I don't know. But without even getting that far and without saying that, chiefly we're interested in him because of the fact that contrary to Archelaus or the prefect procuratorship down in Jerusalem, Jesus doesn't live there in Judea. He is born, or he is raised rather, and brought up north. He's brought up in Galilee. So it's very important to know who's the ruler then, and to see what type of situation could we have on our hands with Jesus, the new king that Antipas had to know about. I mean, these rumors would spread, not just rumors, but the true account of his birth and some of his fame would have spread rather quickly, and it would have gotten back to Herod Antipas. And how does he deal with that? Well, we'll see a little more about that later. Let's begin with his building projects before we get into the chief areas where he will be important in the New Testament. Two things really to mention here. First of all, he rebuilt and fortified a city called Sepphoris, 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 which up until just about this time, first few years of the second decade A.D., was the capital of this northern area. I'm going to kind of show you what we're going to be looking at here. We have another very, very small slide presentation that does not have to do with Sepphoris, that has to do with something else, but let me show you what we're going to be looking at here. Let's draw our little diagram of the land of Palestine again. Here we're talking about the Sea of Galilee. We have the Dead Sea down here. This little prominence here, of course, is Mount Carmel. We draw almost a straight line from Mount Carmel over to the bottom of the Sea of Galilee, the southern tip. Right about here, we're going to have the city of Nazareth. Right about here, we have the city of Nain, N-A-I-N, where the widow's son was raised. That's a little bit to the southeast. Almost due north, a few miles from Nazareth, up here is Cana, C-A-N-A, that's mentioned over in John chapters 2 and 4, Cana of Galilee. Nobleman's son is healed there, and the marriage feast, and the water turned to wine. Oh, there's a little discussion where Magdala actually is, but maybe Magdala is right about there. Remember, there's a woman in the Gospels known as Mary Magdalene. That means she came from the city of Magdala, which is perhaps somewhere in this area. Sepphoris, the city we're talking about, is that middle X. Right here. In other words, it's just in between Nazareth and Cana. This is the first thing that he rebuilds. Remember, all the others basically have been involved in something. You remember some of the cities that Herod the Great built? Archelaus even did a couple of things. He refortified, rebuilt Jericho after it was partially demolished at the death of his father, and built another city a little bit north of Jericho, which he named after himself, Archelaus. Right there you have Jericho, right here you have Archelaus. You know the other things that Herod the Great did. Sepphoris is one thing. This was the early capital initially. It returns later. I think by the time we get to Herod Agrippa II, it will return as capital of this northern area. Nazareth was never thought to be the capital. But the chief significant architectural work of Herod Antipas was a city built right here, the western shore of the Sea of Galilee, just a little below the halfway mark, which was Tiberias. Tiberias, you recognize the name? Where did he get a name like that? Named after Caesar. Caesar Tiberius. Tiberius Caesar. Herod Antipas built the city, really probably rebuilt. I've told you that before. We never really mean built, but rebuilt, refortified. He had been raised with the extravagance, the luxury of Rome. He was accustomed to palatial architecture around him. It's exactly what he did. Built stadiums, swimming pools, palaces, Colosseum-type deals, all types of things that he built here. It's probably the only city that's on the Sea of Galilee from that day until this day that has maintained itself basically with the same name. Most of the cities have changed, picked up Arab names, Arabic names, or something similar. You've got the old city and the new city. The new city of Tiberias is just a little bit further up the coast from the old city of Tiberias, of which there are not a whole lot of remains. So what we're going to be looking at here, just to acclimate you geographically and directionally here, some pictures of not old Tiberias, but new Tiberias to show you around where it was on the Sea of Galilee, what new Tiberias looks like right now. Remember, it was built by Herod Antipas in the year 22 A.D. He rebuilt Sepphoris first. He built this 22 A.D., about halfway or so through his reign, naming it after the new Caesar, who's been Caesar now for, about 8 years, naming it Tiberias. Tiberias was and is thought to be in Jerusalem and among the Jews one of the 4 holy cities of the Jewish people. That ranks it way up there above all of these important ancient historical cities. 4 holy cities among the Jews. This was one of them. You want to take a guess what the other three are? Jerusalem? That's a fairly obvious guess. You don't win anything with that. Hebron, remember that's an ancient city way back to the patriarchs. And Safed, you wouldn't be familiar with that because that's a newer city. Oh, our familiar friend. We can all... That was a pet canary that belonged to Herod Antipas. No, that's our focus slide. Here's the modern city of Tiberias. It's a beautiful city. It's continued in existence all down through history. The reason why it is one of the 4 holy cities as far as the Jews are concerned is, remember, so many things had to do with Tiberias. After the fall of Jerusalem, this is where the Mishnah was completed. Remember, the Palestinian Talmud was actually referred to as the Tiberias Talmud because there was a great group of rabbi scholars who migrated northward from Jerusalem to Tiberias after the fall of the city in A.D. 70. There was the Babylonian Talmud, there was the Palestinian Talmud, which was produced at Tiberias. Many rabbis, most of the famous important rabbis all the way through Israel's history since the 1st century A.D. up until present times, has lived, died, and been buried. 2 of the most famous Jewish rabbis of the past that go back to the Middle Ages, their tombs now are marked here in Tiberias, so it's a very, very important city. It's important as far as we're concerned because A, it was built by Herod Antipas. More importantly, B, it became the capital under the reign of Antipas. He took the capital, recognition of it, away from Sepphoris and moved it over here to Tiberias. So it's very, very important. And you saw on the map that I had up here how it's just a few miles to the east of where Jesus would have been brought up and lived for so many years in Nazareth. And meanwhile, the tetrarch of this northern area, Galilee, as well as the eastern area, across Jordan from Jericho, Perea, would have had his residence and would have lived all of this time. As a matter of fact, he, of course, is older than Jesus. He was born before Jesus. He comes to rule just about the time Jesus is getting back up here to Nazareth. And then he rules way, 39 A.D., way past the time of Jesus' death, burial, and ascension. So we're looking, we'd have to be on the west side of the lake, looking across eastwardly to the other side, which, of course, is part of Jordan over there now, a nighttime picture. This is, of course, very modern. Very modern. They're still working on it here. Very modern view of Tiberias. It's on a lazy, hazy summer morning. Notice you can barely see the land over here on the other side. But this would be the highlands. Of course, as you get a little further down here to the south, you're familiar with the news accounts all the time of the Golan Heights. That's where they're found. You can just barely see some of them right here. The Golan Heights that Israel took back in the Six-Day War. This is the River Jordan Tiberias Hotel. This is where we stayed. This is one of my own pictures here. This is where we stayed whenever we were there recently. We are looking more or less toward the northeast right now. I don't know why I got confused whenever I got here, and I was always thinking I was on the east side of the lake looking west, and I was on the west side looking east. So maybe I better not tell you that, or you'll get confused then. As long as you're okay, then I better not say anything. For some reason, I got turned around because we were going around in circles in the bus all the time, and I was thinking we were headed south. Really, we were headed north, so that would reverse the east and the west directions. Swimming pool, I got my first little swim. This little prominence that sticks out, there's another piece of land that connects, and this connects on top of it. One that goes out perpendicular, and that connects parallel to the land. And I got my first little swim in the sea late one evening. It was about midnight, dark, and swimming off that beautiful area. This is the hotel, the modern hotel. There are two of them, this one, and there's one on the other side that we'll see here in a moment. Now, what's interesting about Tiberias as far as Jesus' ministry is concerned is that it's the capital, therefore it's the most important city of Galilee, most important city of the north here. There's not a single reference in the Gospels to the fact that he ever visited the city, which is rather unique. He was raised right next door to this city, Tiberias, and it's the most splendid, grandeur city that exists up in Galilee. And it's only mentioned a few times over in John's Gospel. I think the term only appears a couple of times, 3 times or so. Sometimes there's reference to the sea. Sometimes it's called the Sea of Tiberias, the Tiberias Sea instead of Sea of Galilee. Of course, that's kind of a new name, the Sea of Tiberias, because this being the capital city on the sea, hence the sea was renamed after the capital city. A lot of Jesus' ministry. These slides are not by any means extensive, but just representative for our point of view of a look of Tiberias. Took place up here to the north. Capernaum is up here. Caesarea Philippi is way up north of here. Mount of Beatitudes, where perhaps he gave the Sermon on the Mount up north of here. We're looking again in this same direction up to the north. These are the little boats, or large boats really, that you can jump on and go up to Capernaum, which we did. Tiberias sits 682 feet below sea level. That's how low it is, because that's how low the surface of the water of the Sea of Galilee. Dead Sea is 1,300 feet below sea level, the lowest place on the face of the earth, and the Sea of Galilee and Tiberias are not far behind. It's 682 feet below sea level. I mean, that's really, the climate there is a lot different than you'd be accustomed to. I mean, most of us are accustomed to living anywhere from a couple of hundred to a couple of thousand feet above sea level. And there you're almost 1,000 feet below sea level. I'm just tempted to get off and tell you all types of things about the sea, but we're supposed to be talking about Tiberias here. It's a fabulous fishing sea. It was, of course, we know in gospel days. So many of the disciples, the apostles, were formerly fishermen. And it remains to this day a fabulous sea. It's not that, it's what, like 7 miles by 13 miles or something like that? It's really not that big at all. You can see from one end to the other and from one side to the other. But the fish in it, I think you've got maybe anywhere from 3, 4, 5 to maybe 6 or 7 fish that are found only in the Sea of Galilee and not found anywhere else in the world. Of course, the so-called St. Peter's fish is supposed to be the fish that Peter took the coin out of the mouth of to pay their expenses, taxes, over in Matthew chapter 17. And if you're ever anywhere near Tiberias, you have to always eat some of St. Peter's fish, which we did, which very, very tasty. Another view of the boat and our group here. We're heading up north up to the synagogue at Capernaum here. If any of you have happened to ever notice that red lambskin coat my wife wears that I bought that over when we were overseas. I was overseas in Kushadasi, Turkey. And I had to find someone. These Turks are trying to sell me everything. All of it's hand done. It's made from lamb skin. Some of that's the best material in the world. You pay an arm and a leg down in New York for something that you can get for a good price over there in Kushadasi. I had to find someone who was the right size. And I asked, who's 5'2" and weighs 105 pounds? And most of the old ladies just, they wish they were 5'2" and weighed 105 pounds. I found this little lady right here. She was 5'2" and weighed 105 pounds. Lady in this blue skirt here. So she tried it on for me, make sure it fit my wife. Well, that's all free. You notice this? Here's a good view. This is out in the sea, looking back toward our hotel. This was our hotel right here. That was my room, very top floor. These are glass elevators that go up and down. 2 glass elevators, so you have a beautiful view of the sea. And here's the other hotel just a little bit down, built very, very similar to one another. Here's Tiberias, and the old city would have been a little to the south of that. Notice this huge mountain range that we find behind here. And this one little place, it's basically you have a lot of mountain ranges, as we have the Golan Heights to the south on the east side of the Sea of Galilee. Basically, you have mountain ranges that rise from just the shoreline. You'd have to, since we're talking about a sea that's 682 feet on the surface below sea level. One of the few places where the mountains recede, just for like a couple of miles here, is right here at Tiberias. Obviously, that's why they built the city here. But the mountains recede into the background. You can tell how high those mountains are that many times are right here on the coast, especially on the east, sometimes on the west, never on the north or the south, though. The close-up view of our hotel. Of course, you can't see me out there because I'm taking a picture. I was going to leave my towel hanging out right there so I know what room, but I know it was that room right there. Just beautiful there. Just beautiful.
How old are those walls next to the sea?
These aren't very old at all. Most of the things that you see here, if you see anything, these are all modern right here. It's all modern. But you have a lot of Crusader works that still remain. Remember the Crusaders fighting the Turks all the time, and a lot of the building remains that one finds will be from the Crusader era and not from the older New Testament. It's very rare, like in Jerusalem, we've got part of Hezekiah's wall that's extant, that's been discovered. And that's rare to go all the way back to Hezekiah's time and find something. A lot of it dates from Crusader era. I don't know that Antipas built anything quite like that looked quite that nice. But he did do a lot of work around there. No glass elevators. Maybe they had cranes like that. They had to have something to do the building they did, and we have never discovered their cranes. This is just a typical scene that you'll find around the Sea of Galilee. Here we're up to the north now. You can see the big mountains over here. We must be northwest looking southeast then, where you'll find a lot of the mountains. Beautiful pasture area, rolling hills up there. Typical scenes of generally little Arab boys. This is probably an Arab and not a Jew. But typical scene of a little Arab boy with his sheep and goats out with him out to pasture.
Are they out working like that most of the time? Do they, quote unquote, go to school? Or?
Well, they go to school. Definitely they go to school. But in the summertime, you'll find most of them out like this. Notice what the sheep look like. not exactly like our sheep, a little bit different. And here we're looking from just a little bit north of Tiberias, looking at the sun. So there's one reason that he's very significant, Herod Antipas, the building of Tiberias. Let's start over in Luke chapter 3 and verse 1 for a little material before we get into some areas where he is significant. Luke chapter 3 and verse 1. Make sure we cover all these references where these men are found. 15th year of the reign of Tiberius Caesar, Pontius Pilate being governor of Judea, and Herod Antipas being tetrarch of Galilee. Herod Antipas. There's one place. You'll become familiar with the first couple of verses of chapters 2 and 3 of Luke by the time we're through, because he's dating a lot of his material by the reigns of these various individuals. Now, what I want to begin looking at are the 3 specific episodes in the Gospels that must be commented upon where Herod Antipas so forcefully enters into the gospel narrative picture. Last 2 of these will relate to Jesus. The first of these relates specifically to John the Baptist. Since Jesus spent a lot of his early public ministry in Galilee, this would be the Roman leader he would most often come into contact with. John the Baptist, however, would present maybe a little different question, because we know that John the Baptist is from the south. Well, let's deal with the first of these, and that concerns his marriage problems. Seems like most of those in the Herodian family have had marriage problems at one time or another. Not of the minor magnitude, but a great magnitude of problems that they have ends up, of course, costing John the Baptist his life via his head being cut off. Antipas was married to the daughter of Aretas the Fourth of 2 Corinthians 11:32, who was king of the Nabateans. We'll begin there to see how his marriage went sour on him. Now, we've mentioned this passage, we mentioned this man, as well as one of his earlier forefathers on 2 or 3 or 4 occasions now. 2 Corinthians chapter 11, verse 32. In Damascus, the governor under Aretas, this is Aretas the Fourth. Aretas the Third came way back in BC years. Aretas the Fourth, the king, kept the city of Damascus with a garrison desirous to apprehend me. Now, we're going to start doing a whole lot of legwork here and connecting all of these various people in their marriage relationships and blood relationships to one another, and it will get a little confusing. So now we've jumped from the Gospels way over here into 2 Corinthians to introduce ourselves here to Aretas the Fourth. His daughter was originally and initially married to Herod Antipas, and he's king of the Nabateans. And we'll come back to that later. We'll come back to that maybe in the next message. So you have to kind of put that in a pigeonhole now by itself, and we'll return to it later. On a trip to Rome, after he was already made tetrarch of Galilee, he stayed with his brother. Of course, he'd be going back and forth to Rome every now and then for obvious political context here. He stayed with his brother and his wife. While staying with them, he fell madly in love with this woman, his brother's wife, seduced her, caused her to fall in love with him, which then necessitated that both of them go about divorcing their current spouses in order to marry one another. That is the scene behind the scene that's presented in Matthew, Mark, and Luke, not in John, but in Matthew, Mark, and Luke, of the marriage confrontation between John the Baptist and Herod the Tetrarch, Herod Antipas. Who was this woman? This woman's name was Herodias. Notice we're back to Herod again. Herodium, a fortress. Herodias, a woman. Herod Antipas, Herod Philip, Herod the Great, Herod Agrippa the First, Herod Agrippa the Second. Herod is most important for founding the Herodian dynasty. Herodias was the daughter of Berenice and Aristobulus. Aristobulus was the son of Herod the Great by Mariamne the First. Remember, Herod the Great had two wives. After he divorced Doris, he had two wives. Mariamne the First, the one that he really loved, and then he married another little peasant girl, as it were, whose name happened to be Mariamne. Perhaps that's the reason why he married this woman, that elevated her father to the high priesthood. Herodias is the daughter of Berenice and Aristobulus. Aristobulus is one of many, just dozens of sons, children, of Herod the Great, this time by Mariamne, who was the granddaughter through her mother of Hyrcanus. Remember, she's the granddaughter through her father Alexander of Aristobulus II, and she's the granddaughter through her mother Alexandra of Hyrcanus II. So she is connected in the right way. That's why Herod ends up marrying her, and then we have Aristobulus produced as a result of that, and then Aristobulus marries Berenice, and Berenice and Aristobulus produce Herodias, who is first of all married to one man, Herod Philip, who was not Herod Philip the Tetrarch, but another of the half-brothers, whose name also was Philip, and whose name also was Herod. Yes, I do have a genealogical outline worked up for you, but since I gave you one treat tonight via this slide presentation, you don't need two treats in one night, do you? We'll wait until the next time, and I'll bring you that genealogical outline, and then you can see if you can piece all of it together. First of all, you can start tonight in your mind. We don't want you to have a crutch to lean on. You can work it out in your mind, and you can have it worked out before you. Okay, did you get all that now? You're just looking at me here, and you're supposed to have all of that down by now. Herodias is the daughter of Berenice and Aristobulus. Aristobulus is the son of Herod through Mariamne, which makes him then a half-brother to Herod Antipas and Archelaus, because they're a son of Herod through Malthrace, who was a Samaritan woman.
For the continuation of this message, please
Berenice and Aristobulus. Aristobulus is the son of Herod through Mariamne, which makes him then a half-brother to Herod Antipas and Archelaus, because they're a son of Herod through Malthrace, who was a Samaritan woman. She was married, Herodias was initially married to Herod Philip. She's the one that Antipas is going to marry now after he seduces her and then causes her to divorce Herod Philip and causes him to divorce the daughter of Aretas IV, who was king of the Nabateans. Now, we mentioned Philip last time. There are three important sons of Herod the Great of which we would look. Archelaus, who's an ethnarch, Herod Antipas, who was a tetrarch, and then Philip, who was a tetrarch of Idurea and of Trachonitis, according to Luke chapter 3 and verse 1. That Herod Philip is a different Herod Philip from this Herod Philip. We're talking about brothers, or really half-brothers again. This Herod Philip was the son of Herod the Great by the second Mariamne wife that he had. So we're still talking about descendants of Herod the Great. We're still talking about the whole brotherhood clan, we could say, but most of these guys are half-brothers. Archelaus and Antipas are full brothers. They come through Herod and Malthrace. But Aristobulus now comes through Mariamne the First. Herod Philip comes through Mariamne the Second. That makes both of them half-brothers to one another, as well as half-brothers to Archelaus and to Herod Antipas. Now, Mariamne the Second, remember after Herod the Great's second wife, his first important wife, Mariamne the First, granddaughter through mother and father of Aristobulus II and Hyrcanus II, died, he seemed to be very, very much in love with this woman. And so as a result, when he picks another wife, he picks another wife who also has the same name, Mariamne, which was a fairly common name of that day. He marries this woman who is the daughter of a priest by the name of Simon. Of course, Herod the Great doesn't like the way it looks that he's married more or less to a commoner here. And remember, he elevates her father, Simon, from priesthood to the high priesthood just because of the fact that he married his daughter, Mariamne. Now, this Philip, the one way that you can kind of keep him differentiated from the other Philip, both of them are known as Herod Philip. The one way you can kind of keep him differentiated is the fact that he is a non-political son of Herod, which is remarkable. Most of his sons are involved in politics. This Herod Philip, the initial husband of Herodias, who of course is a half-brother to Herod Antipas, who seduces her and takes her from his half-brother Herod Philip, was nothing but a private citizen. He was not involved in politics. Now, in the Gospels, he's referred to simply as Philip. In Matthew 14:3, we'll look at that later on. In Mark 6:17 and Luke 3:19, he's referred to just as Philip, the first former husband of Herodias. Now, what does that tell you about Herodias, first of all, and Herod Philip? We have to begin here as we're building this whole thing together. Maybe I should have brought that genealogy along. Well, you'll be the more appreciative whenever I bring it along Sunday morning then. Well, Herodias is the daughter of Aristobulus, who was a son of Herod. So if Herodias is the daughter of Aristobulus, a son of Herod, and then marries Herod Philip, another son of Herod, then and these are half-brothers, and she is in effect marrying her uncle. She descends through one half-brother, marries an uncle, the half-brother of Aristobulus, who is Herod Philip. So Aristobulus, and then this Philip and Antipas are all half-brothers. They're all coming from different mothers. Herodias then left Herod Philip, the first one, the non-political one that we're talking about, in order to marry Antipas. However, before she leaves Herod Philip, she bears him one daughter whose name is Salome, and she figures into the gospel accounts as well. Salome. She bears Herod Philip, her uncle and her first husband, a daughter named Salome. So she's the daughter of one half-brother of Antipas, which is Aristobulus. Antipas comes through Malthrace, and Aristobulus comes through Mariamne the First. She's a daughter of one half-brother. She's a wife of another half-brother, which then, whenever she marries Antipas, it makes her his sister-in-law as well as his niece that he marries. She then marries her uncle. Now, you have to have this down because of what John the Baptist is going to say about their relationship here. Her being the daughter of one half-brother and the wife of another, when she marries Antipas, that makes her his sister-in-law and his niece. You're still just staring. She marries her uncle for the second time. She married another uncle earlier. All these are half-brothers of Aristobulus, and she marries uncle the first time, uncle the second time. Sister-in-law to Antipas and niece to Herod Antipas whenever she marries. Okay, let's look at the accounts then. I don't think the biblical accounts will help you. Well, they'll help you because they don't give you any material like I just gave you, so you don't have to be concerned about much. Mark chapter 6, verses 14 through 29. With Matthew 14, 1 through 12, and then Luke 3, 19 and 20, with chapter 9, verses 7 to 9. See, I told you it's complicated. The Herodian dynasty is very, very complicated. He has 10 wives. So you can tell how many sons and daughters he'll have and how many half-brothers and half-sisters he'll end up having. And all of these characters then start marrying one another, and then you forget if you're talking about an uncle or a bunny rabbit then. King Herod, Mark chapter 6 and verse 14. Now, what have we said about this verse and that phrase right there? King Herod. Are we talking about Herod the Great here? Yes? Okay, where did I lose all of you guys? We need to start way over somewhere. This is Antipas here? Okay, so why are some of us thinking Herod the Great then? Herod the king? Okay, that's really what I'm getting at. What did I say about this? You're right, you're thinking about something. When it says Herod the king, you're going to think the one who was king of the Jews then. So what did I say about this then? It's used in a loose sense. The term king is used in a loose sense here. Herod Antipas was not a king, he was a tetrarch. His father was the king, Herod the Great. That's why, like it does to some of you here, it will throw you off very, very quickly. When you see King Herod, you think Herod the Great. But that's only in Matthew chapter 2 and verse 1. That's only in Luke chapter 1 and verse 5. Herod, king of Judea. So king here is used in a loose sense. Now what did we say about Luke compared to Matthew and Mark on this account here? He's more technical. He never refers to these guys as king if they're not a king. But Matthew and Mark do refer to Herod Antipas as a king. Okay, so king is okay. He's using it in a loose sense, which means ruler. We want to be technical. We read, and tetrarch Herod heard of him. For his name was spread abroad. He said that John the Baptist was risen from the dead, and therefore mighty works do show forth themselves in him. Now Mark, whenever he introduces that statement of Herod Antipas, then he has to go on and tell the whole background, or we would know what he's talking about John Baptist. But of course the statement here is made concerning Jesus. King Herod heard of him. Who's the him? He heard of Jesus. He heard of Jesus. For his name was spread abroad. He has his capital right over here in Tiberias. A little bit west of that, Jesus is brought up in Nazareth. And he said that John Baptist was risen from the dead, and therefore mighty works do show forth themselves in him. In other words, Mark's kind of looking back. He's looking back through Herod Antipas, who is looking back on something that's already taken place, the execution of John Baptist. Of course, Mark hasn't told us about the execution of John Baptist, so he's going to tell us now. Verse 16, when Herod heard thereof, he said, it is John whom I beheaded. He is risen from the dead. And here's the verse that tells you succinctly what I elaborated on a moment ago. Herod himself had sent forth and laid hold upon John and bound him in prison, in Tiberias, no doubt. Some of the monks think they can still show us where his prison cell was. For Herodias' sake, his brother Philip's wife, for he had married her. Okay, more technically, we'd say for his half-brother's sake. Same father, different mother. We'd say more technically for his half-brother Herod Philip's wife. And then we'd say more technically for his half-brother, the non-political private citizen Herod Philip's wife, for he had married her. Okay, now if you want to make a marginalia reference there, that will be fine. A mental one in one of your notes will be a lot better, though. For Herodias' sake, his brother Philip's wife. Now I tell you that because if you hold your finger there and jump over to Luke chapter 3 and verse 1, we'll be back here many times until we're through. Luke 3:1 and Luke 2:1. Reign of Tiberius Caesar, Pontius Pilate, Herod, tetrarch of Galilee, and his brother, really half-brother here, Antipas, Herod Antipas, tetrarch of Galilee, full brother of Archelaus, and his brother Philip, tetrarch of Idarea and Trachonitis. Now this Philip is just called Philip here, brother Philip. Well, over here in Mark, chapter 6 and verse 17. Same Herod we're talking about, Herod Antipas, and now it's Philip, just told us as brother Philip. Two different Philips, though. Two different Herods, two different Herod Philips. One political over in Luke, one a private citizen, non-political over in Mark, chapter 6 and verse 17. He is the one initially married to Herodias, and through her he produces their daughter Salome. For John had said unto Herod, It is not lawful for thee to have thy brother's wife. For John had said unto Herod, It is not lawful for thee to have thy brother's wife. And we're not going to go into too much detail here, but I just point out one thing that's very interesting of the boldness of John the Baptist in his preaching mission. If you jump over to Luke chapter 1, verses 39 and 40, then the last verse of that chapter. Mary entered into the house of Zechariah and saluted, verse 39. Mary arose in those days and went into the hill country with haste into a city of Judah. Now that's important. And entered into the house of Zechariah and saluted Elizabeth. Then the last verse of that chapter. The child grew, John the Baptist, the child grew and waxed strong in spirit and was in the deserts till the day of his showing in Israel. Now, back up here, here's what we have. We've got our Sea of Galilee here. We've got the Dead Sea here. Jerusalem here. This territory just on the western side of the Dead Sea is known as the wilderness of Judea. It's generally hypothesized that John Baptist is born somewhere down here. We've got Bethlehem here, probably born somewhere here, maybe further down, no one really knows. Probably this is the city that we're talking about here in verse 39, that she went to a city in the hill country of Judah. We know this is hill country. As you get closer to the sea, it levels out into the plain area, the maritime plains. As you get over here, we're talking about hill country there. Okay, you say, what's the big deal about this? Here's where Antipas is with his capital up here in Tiberias. Now, this whole region of Samaria right here and Judea down here is controlled by other people now. He just controls up here in Galilee and over here in Perea. So it's remarkable that John the Baptist, we don't know much about his ministry. We know that he's baptizing in Jordan, which is probably right here in southern Jordan, just before he empties into the Dead Sea. Most of his ministry is down here. We see from that 80th verse that he spent all of his days out in the wilderness, probably the wilderness of Judea out here. What in the world is he doing way up here in Galilee in Tiberias? Shows how bold and fearless of a preacher he was. He knew that the political leader of Galilee was involved in a marriage relationship that for the Jews was unscriptural, was wrong. And of all things, he took it upon himself to travel the whole length of the country to go up there and evidently rebuke this man to his face. Now you see, you wouldn't know that otherwise until you study all this geography, what John is really doing, and how bold and fearless of a preacher he really was. He could have dealt with the common prefects and procurators down here in Jerusalem. I mean, these are Roman guys, so they have their own sins, their own problems they're involved in. But he goes all the way up here to Galilee and all the way up here to Tiberias to deal with this man who he believes has an unscriptural relationship in his marriage. Now, we can ask ourselves the question before we go on, what's unscriptural in his marriage? Well, there's no reason to assume that according to some of the current laws available for the Jews, that the divorce and remarriage procedure of theirs was necessarily unlawful. In other words, I'm saying that probably is not the issue of divorce and remarriage. Now, that's been hypothesized by some, that the whole problem here with Herod Antipas and Herodias is the question and the subject of divorce and remarriage. I don't think too many people hold to that who study that. I don't think that that's what John has in his mind whenever he goes up here and rebukes this man. No, if you'll turn back to your Old Testament, back to the book of Leviticus, chapter 18 and verse 16, John probably has in mind not current Jewish laws, but Mosaic law, Old Testament law, that forbade as follows: Thou shalt not uncover the nakedness of thy brother's wife. It is thy brother's nakedness. What's exactly what we've got here? Thou shalt not uncover the nakedness of thy brother's wife. Because we've got these half-brothers involved in this situation, Herod Antipas and Herod Philip. They're half-brothers. So in essence, according to what Moses says here in Leviticus chapter 18 and verse 16, then Herod Antipas is uncovering the nakedness of his brother Herod Philip. And Leviticus chapter 20 and verse 21. If a man shall take his brother's wife, it is an unclean thing She had already borne a child, Salome. So we're not talking about levirate law of marriage here. She had already borne a daughter, Salome, to Herod Philip. It is an unclean thing. He hath uncovered his brother's nakedness. They shall be childless. Of course, she already has a child through the first husband, so we're only talking about the second husband here. As far as we know, they didn't have any children. That would have to be true. Herod Antipas and Herodias, or God's word would not have been fulfilled. So that seems to be what we have over here. If you go back to Mark's account, Mark chapter 6 and verse 18, it is not lawful for thee to have thy brother's wife. According to divorce and remarriage, according to current Jewish standards, no, according to purity laws of the Levitical categories. So we're saying John could have just stayed down south where he was not running into much trouble, and just preached and preached against Herod Antipas down there. The word would have gotten back up to Herod Antipas sooner or later, that some lunatic of a Jewish prophet down in the Judean deserts prophesying against him. It would have gotten up to him, and what would have happened for John? Probably nothing. That's the point. Just because he went up there doesn't mean that he dissolves a relationship between these two. But he's like a voice crying in the wilderness, and he's going to call out what's wrong and what's sin about this. He could have stayed down there and saved his life. Of course, he doesn't because he's the Lord's bold, fearless prophet. Of course, he's in prison here. Therefore, Herodias had a quarrel against him and would have killed him, but she could not. For Herod feared John, knowing that he was a just man and a holy one. And so he observed him, and when he heard him, he did many things and heard him gladly. And when a convenient day was come, that Herod on his birthday made a supper to his lords, high captains, and chief estates of Galilee. When the daughter of the said Herodias, that's Salome now, who was about 13 years of age at this time, came in and danced and pleased Herod, probably in a seductive fashion and method, only 13 years of age, by the way. And she'll figure into the picture later on, if you remember Salome here at this point. And them that sat with him, the king said to the damsel, Ask of me whatsoever thou wilt, and I will give it thee. He sware unto her, Whatsoever you shall ask, I'll give you to half of my kingdom, Galilee and Perea. She went forth and said to her mother, What shall I ask? Her mother said, The head of John the Baptist. Remember, we read back up here in verse 17 that he had been bound, John the Baptist, in prison for Herodias' sake, not for Herod. Herod was, we read that as well. He was afraid, verse 20 of John, because he was a prophet, a just man, a holy man. But Herodias had no scruples about religious, prophetical considerations at all. So she came in straightway with haste unto the king, and asked, saying, I will that thou give me by and by in a charger or on a platter the head of John the Baptist. The king was exceeding sorry, yet for his oath's sake and for their sakes which sat with him, really he means his sake, because of the people sitting before him, he would not reject her. Immediately the king sent an executioner and commanded his head to be brought, and he went and beheaded him in the prison. And he brought his head on a platter and gave it to the damsel, and the damsel gave it to her mother. And when his disciples heard of it, they came and took up his corpse and laid it in a tomb. So his disciples evidently were either there in Tiberias, which is probably true, or all the way back down in the Judean wilderness. Probably they'd followed him up there. They were just biding their time, as it were, in Tiberias, waiting to see what Herod Antipas would do with John the Baptist. Now that's found over in Matthew 14, verses 1 to 12. We're not going to look at that. But we'll go over to Luke's account. Luke's very, very brief in this. Luke chapter 3, verses 19 and 20. Luke 3, verse 19. But Herod the king? No, Herod the tetrarch. Luke is the specific one of the three. Herod the tetrarch, being reproved by him for Herodias, his brother Philip's wife. And then Luke adds in this remark, and for all the evils which Herod had done. Now, exactly what he means by this, we don't know, but there could be one suggestion that we might take a look at later on. It'll be here in Luke's Gospel, of course. for all the evils which Herod had done. Added yet this above all, that he shut up John in prison. Now, Luke then gets kind of sidetracked in his genealogy here of Christ and introduces the whole ministry of Christ, and he kind of leaves us hanging what happened to John. Added yet this above all, that is, above all the evils formerly done by him, that he shut up John in prison. Well, if you skip all the way over to the 9th chapter, the 7th through the 9th verses, it comes back to Luke's mind. He picks up this topic again and tells us what happened to John. All he tells us in the 3rd chapter, in the 20th verse, is that he was in prison. And all of these references we're saying are Herod Antipas references here. Now Herod the Tetrarch, see, he's not Herod the King. In Matthew he's Herod the King, in Mark he's Herod the King, but in Luke he's always Herod the Tetrarch, or just Herod. Heard of all that was done by him, by Jesus, and he was perplexed because that it was said of some that John was risen from the dead. So you kind of then assume in your mind that John, A, was in prison, and B, killed while he was in prison, or he couldn't be dead by the time we get to chapter 9. Of some that Elias had appeared, and others that one of the old prophets was risen again. Herod said, John have I beheaded. Now there finally Luke tells us what happened. Herod Antipas beheaded John the Baptist. And who is this, of whom I hear such things, and he desired to see him? Now don't forget that little phrase, because Luke will pick that phrase up later on, I think in the 23rd chapter. We'll be back to that probably in the next message, and Luke will develop that little statement further. And he desired to see him. So there's the best known, probably the most important, but certainly the best known of the appearances on the gospel scene of Herod Antipas. Marriage situation, how it cost John the Baptist his life. Okay, let's move on to one other area before we conclude this evening. 3 times he appears, 3 significant times. The other 2 will remain here in Luke, first of all over in chapter 13, verses 31 through 33. And here we see him by this well-known term, and he's been referred to by this phrase ever since that time, not so much as Herod Antipas, but as Herod the Fox. Luke 13, verses 31 through 33. The same day there came certain of the Pharisees, saying unto him, to Jesus, Get thee out, and depart hence. Now, we don't know exactly where he is at this time. We are told in the 22nd verse that he went through the cities and villages teaching and journeying toward Jerusalem. The way that he probably would have gone to Jerusalem would have been from Galilee down the border across the Sea of Galilee, or across Jordan River through Perea and then over to Jerusalem in this manner. Therefore, he'd go through Herod Antipas' territory twice. Once while he's up here in Galilee, once whenever he gets down here in Perea. So he's either in Perea or in Galilee, one or the other of those places whenever this is said. Probably we should think of Galilee, since Herod Antipas could make a more direct threat and carry it out if Jesus is still here in Galilee and not down here in Perea. Because, look at the next part of the 31st verse, for Herod will kill thee. Now we don't know the motive of the Pharisees in saying what they did. They generally weren't friends of Jesus. Now it looks as though they're trying to preserve his life. But there could be something else behind that. The reasons behind their statement really are not certain. And he said unto them, Go ye and tell that fox. He's just as bold as John the Baptist, probably right here in the territory of Herod Antipas. And he said, Go tell that fox. Now what does he mean by the term fox? Well, when we do a little research in Jewish usage of that day, it could mean one of 2 things. For us, only the former of these reasons or meanings exist. It could mean, by designating him as a fox, a man who is sly, covert, deceptive. So that's what we mean by fox. We talk about someone as being sly as a fox. However, that's not the only way the word appears in Jewish writings of the first century, and it's not even the most frequent way it appears in Jewish writings of the first century, because the second of these would take that place. And that is, the second meaning of the term is insignificant. And it's many times used especially in comparison to a lion. A fox is insignificant in comparison to a lion. So there is perhaps a combination of meanings in this passage. If there is a combination of meanings, the second meaning would take preeminence. If there's only one meaning implied here, it would definitely be the second. Now, a lot of people don't know that. They think by fox what we as an Englishman thinks as sly, deceptive, covert. Probably he means insignificant. You're just a little measly tetrarch up there in Tiberias is all you are. You're no king. You're a nobody. That's what he means. And in other words, it's a very contemptuous term here. Go and tell that fox, behold, I cast out demons. I do cures today and tomorrow. And the third day I shall be perfected. Another common Jewish saying of that day. Nevertheless, I must walk today and tomorrow and the third day, for it cannot be that a prophet perish out of Jerusalem. Now, Antipas had already killed John by this time, of course. And over in Mark 8 and verse 15, one of the times whenever Jesus warns his disciples, beware of the leaven of the Pharisees and Sadducees, in Mark 8:15 he adds in, and beware of the leaven of Herod. And he means Herod Antipas in Mark 8:15. He's got false teaching by virtue of the fact he has false practice, Jewish practice in his life, in his marriage situation, as well as some other things we could mention. He's already killed one Jewish prophet. He probably does not want to have to eliminate another Jewish prophet, and so we could guess he's sending out a threat, hoping that Jesus will take him up at his threat in Luke 13:31 and leave the territory. Of course, we know from verse 22, Luke has told us Jesus is already leaving the territory before he ever gets this threat via the Pharisees of Herod, saying that Herod will kill you. So it's another reference, just in Jesus referring to him as that fox, that Jesus had a fearless and a bold message and ministry, a message to proclaim and a ministry to carry out on the same order as John the Baptist. For John the Baptist, it cost him his life. For Jesus, it cost him his life, but at a later time and under a different figure, not under Herod Antipas.